So when it comes to behavioral recording, we have a few different strategies we could utilize. First of all, we could use narratives, for example. So if in high school you read Gorillas in the Mist, right? That's a kind of a narrative behavioral recording. Does it have information about gorillas that is important and factual? Yes. Does it also tell a story? Yes. Right? So a lot of behavioral recording might look like that, where there's both a subjective narrative as well as factual information going on. Field notes are going to have a little bit less subjectivity, but still some subjectivity because they can include some interpretation, right? So field notes are just as you'd think, right? So people jotting things down while they're observing something, usually just little bullet points like this or observations. And you might see people doing this, with regard to like a wildlife, so Jane Goodall here, or just people observing other behaviors as well, other human behavior. Checklists are going to be the least subjective, still subjective to some degree, but the least subjective because you have the behaviors itemized and it's just a matter of tallying the number of times you see them. The contrast or the difficulty with something like checklists is you might be so focused on viewing and observing behaviors that you expect to see, you might miss out on other important behaviors because they are not listed and not therefore tallying, right? So you got to keep in mind, even though it's good to have that structure, it's always important to kind of make sure you can observe for other behaviors that maybe were unintended or didn't make it to the checklist itself. You can also do what's referred to as temporal measures. Temporal simply just meaning time. And there's 4 strategies here for measuring something. So reaction time. So for example, you're stopped at a stoplight, the light is red, and you're the first person at the light, and the light goes green. Your reaction time is how long it takes before you start to go forward, from when the light turns green to when you start to move your car forward. If you live in Houston, you've got about 1/13 of a second before somebody behind you honks. But that reaction time is a temporal measure. How quickly can you respond to a given stimuli? Task completion time. Task completion time has a definitive beginning and a definitive end, right? So when I'm driving home from work, if I set my GPS to send me home, right, it tells me what time I should arrive home. My journey has a definite beginning and a definite end. Okay, well, I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me. Definite beginning and definite end, right? And the duration, the time that it takes, the time elapsed is task completion time. Latency is the delay between certain behaviors. So for example, if you're observing somebody's eating habits, let's say you're a dietitian and you're observing people's eating habits, right? You might observe the time between when they take one bite and when they take the next bite, right? The latency in the behavior between one bite and the next, right? Or the latency in behavior between one meal and the next. Basically, it's the delay between when the behavior is shown and then shown again. Duration sometimes is easily confused with task completion time. Duration, by contrast, does not have a definitive end, right? It's simply how long a behavior is demonstrated. So for those more mature members of the student audience I'm speaking to, you might remember back when gas was really cheap. When I first started driving, you could get a gallon of gas for just under $1. And so there was times where I would just fill up my truck and go drive. Just go for a drive. And I didn't know where I was going, didn't know where I would end up, how far I would go, how long it would take. I would just drive, right? So that would be duration, because I'm simply just driving till I get tired of driving, not trying to get anywhere, just going until I get tired of driving. Duration is kind of that way, a behavior that's demonstrated until it's no longer demonstrated anymore, not because of any kind of finite endpoint, but just because it's no longer demonstrated. Oh, one last thing too with temporal measures, they're good because they're quantifiable. Time is quantifiable. So you could say, okay, well, this task took person 33 seconds, it took that person 28 seconds. And you can compare the times like that. So it's very numeric, very linear in the analysis style. The problem with observational methods is we have to make sure that we have good reliability in observation, right? So if you watch the recent Winter Olympics, figure skating, I think, is a fascinating sport. I actually really love Olympic figure skating. But it always amazes me how the judges score the individuals on their performance, right? And, a time was, a while ago, you would get 4 judges that have very similar scores, 4.7, 4.8, 4.8, 4.7, like this, and then you get someone else who's like a 3.2, right, just out of the blue. That is very poor inter-rater or inter-observer reliability. We don't want that, right? Ideally, the observation would be consistently assessed. So what you'll find is now there's actually a lot more continuity, a lot more reliability between the observers, and part of it has to do with training, right? These judges are trained, retrained, continuously evaluate footage, continuously evaluate scoring. They're recalibrated and calibrated again. That's going to increase the reliability of the observation, and thus their scores should be fairly similar. right? For example, if we were having a face-to-face class, there's a Disney video on YouTube that has acts of violence that are seen in Disney. So Disney's actually got a lot of violence in it, all right? And so I show it to my students, ask them to watch the whole thing and tell me how many acts of violence they see in the video, right? And we share our scores. And usually the scores range from like 22 to like 53. I mean, there's a really broad range. And the video is only like 78 seconds long. I mean, it's barely over a minute. Um, and uh, and we talk about our observations. We talk about why we scored certain things and why we didn't, everything like that. And then I have them watch it again and rescore it with the same instructions. And what I find is that the range of scores goes down dramatically, simply because we discussed it and therefore increased the reliability of the observational methods. Same kind of idea. Are we looking for the same thing, and do we agree on what we are seeing? This gets expensive. So I always tell my students, I want you to think of your psychological health and your mental well-being as part of your physical health, right? So we need to consider the mind and the body as one unit, right? In light of that, you can do research that utilizes more biometric data, right? So for example, an EEG, electroencephalogram. This allows you to measure neural activity. So if you've seen medical shows where they've got somebody hooked up to a heart monitor, it's dee 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 like this. That's actually measuring the electrical charge in the heart, right? So when it beats, an electrical charge moves through the muscle. This is the same thing, but for your brain, right? So that's why you've got these little nodes, electrodes stuck to your head like this, and it picks up the electrical activity in your brain. Very useful for like sleep studies, for example. So it can look at how the brain fires while you're sleeping, when you're awake, things like this. Very useful, right? Neuroimaging too. So you might actually use what's called an Fmri. That stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. And what that allows you to do, and there's a picture at the bottom right there, what it allows the scientists to do is actually look at how blood flows in the brain and where parts of the brain are more oxygenated than others. So like in the 4 examples we see here, there's very different patterns of oxygenation, and that'll allow you to see which areas are functioning well, which ones aren't functioning as well, which ones are activated, which ones don't seem to show a lot of activity. We can also look at, for example, measures of autonomic nervous system activity. So things like heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, things that are more automatic, that are not voluntarily controlled for the most part. We can assess those as well. And then likewise, too, we can look at something like blood and saliva assays, adrenaline, cortisol, oxytocin, testosterone, these different hormones and in some cases neurotransmitters will allow us to see what the person's body is doing and therefore kind of relate it back to their behavior or their psychological health. The problem with these is that it's not perfectly linear. It's not a one-to-one sort of situation. So your heart rate might be increased a great deal in class, not because you're nervous about the class, but because you're nervous about the exam you're about to take in the next class. So while these are good measures, you have to keep in mind that what's happening here is not always the same as what's happening here. Not always, right? And what's happening here might trigger this in a way that they don't really line up very well. So just kind of keep that in mind. Interviews and self-reports. So let's start with questions, right? When we do these, when we're creating a script for an interview or when we're creating questions for a self-report measure, we want to make sure that we do this with the participant in mind. We want to be specific. We want to make our questions very clear. We don't want to make assumptions, right? We talked about bias already in a previous chapter. We don't want to assume that participants will feel a certain way, right? So for example, if I was asking about fertility issues, right? If I said something like, how much do you hate abortion, right? That's a loaded question. I'm already asking somebody how much they hate something. I would be better served to say, how do you feel about abortion? All right, because then it allows for, there's less of an angle, less of a kind of a prescriptive direction in my question itself. I don't want to use double-barreled questions. Separate your questions out if you're covering 2 different issues. Also, to response style. So do you want to do a Likert style response? So like a 1 through 5, how much they agree or disagree? Do you want them to be able to pick a frequency? Do you want them to use a free response where they can actually just write how they feel? Keep in mind the type of question and the type of response you use should be reflective. Interviews. Interviews is a lot of stuff here that I don't know that really needs a lot of explanation. Obviously, you want to have friendly interest, show friendly, create an atmosphere of honesty and friendliness. What we want to do is keep a poker face. I think that's probably the most important thing I could put on here for you. Keep a poker face. If a participant tells you something that you think is wrong or surprising, you cannot let it reflect, right? Part of the reason why I'm not a very good interviewer, because people tell me things and I'm like, what? Anyway. We want to make sure we keep a very neutral face, and it would be the same as if you were a therapist. If you were a psychologist, you would be expected to do so too. You don't want your clients to see you viscerally react to something they say, because of course that could hurt their feelings and damage the trusting relationship. So we just want to make sure that when we are doing interviews, we're very stoic, but also give an air of interest and let the participant guide the responses, not the researcher. So when do we use these? Questionnaires are like the McDonald's of research. So if you've ever filled out an online questionnaire or an online survey, they are fast, inexpensive, and convenient, right? They're anonymous as well. So you can say exactly how you feel. If you have a sensitive topic as a researcher, many of my topics are quite sensitive. I do research on racism and mass shootings and things like this. I would rather them do an online questionnaire so they can be anonymous and therefore hopefully be more honest with me. All right. They're very good for sensitive topics as well, as I said. So you want to make sure that people have a platform where they can feel allowed to express their perspectives without potential punishment or reprisal or anything. By contrast, interviews are very, very good with children, for example, cognitively impaired, or any situation, people who are cognitively impaired, any situation where there might be a potential concern of the understanding of the question. Likewise, if the topic is very complex, right, where you might need to, as the researcher, kind of comment on it a bit further, right? This allows for a bit more of a dialogue, a bit more of a narrative in between the participant and the researcher, as opposed to a questionnaire, which is just very one-directional. I've actually done hundreds and hundreds of interviews with children as part of my research on the development of prejudice, and I found it's actually a really good way to go because you can help ensure that the child knows what's going on and answers the question accurately in terms of exactly how they feel. So some issues with this. So I'm going to throw self-report bias out there. So if you're having participants fill out their own questionnaire, you are going to encounter what's called social desirability response bias, right? And what this means is they might think about the answer that they were going to give and judge whether or not they should give it based on how socially desirable or socially acceptable it is, right? So going back to the fertility issue that I mentioned earlier in this lecture, if I was to do this study as a professor at HBU, I might have participants who don't feel comfortable sharing their perspective based on something like their Christian identity, right? In this case, they might produce more of a socially desirable response. They might think he's a Christian professor, so I shouldn't show any positive evaluation of something like abortion, right? In this case, you're trying to change your answer in a way that you think will be most socially acceptable or socially desirable. Participants might also do what's called acquiescence, where they're essentially trying to tell you what they think you want to hear, right? Which is another unfortunate thing because even though it might validate what you think, it's not accurate. It's not actually what they think. So acquiescence can be quite dangerous. By contrast, too, they can also be naysaying. Naysaying is where they go the opposite direction, where they think they know what you want to hear and they say the opposite, which is just exhausting. It's just contrarian, but also just as difficult because now you've got data that's not accurate at all. So some other types of research to consider as we wind this down. Archival research is where you're taking existing data and analyzing it in new ways. So you might look at dental records and divorce rates in the 1930s. All right, you're not creating new data. You're simply just taking old pieces of data and lining them up. Likewise, too, you might do something like content analysis. So anytime a president or political figure gives a speech or makes a tweet or whatever, you can actually start to compile those and start to look for patterns in what they say, how they gesture, where they look. Right? And essentially you're examining or analyzing the content. You're not creating the data, someone else is creating the data. You're simply evaluating it and looking at it to try and gain insights or deeper meaning. Oops, sorry, there we go. One thing I will say is when you're doing something like content analysis, you want to make sure that you are examining things like psycholinguistics, body language, context, right? So if a president gives a speech in the Oval Office, it's different than if they give the speech on the lawn, right? So it's the dynamic is going to be different, right? So when we look at these sort of things, archival research or content analysis, we have to consider them as part of the big picture. Divorce rates and dental records in the 1930s, you have to consider that, okay, well, that was 90 years ago. What was going on 90 years ago that might have impacted both? So in both cases, we're taking this existing data and trying to filter through it and say, okay, what ultimately does it mean? What wisdom can we gain out of what we see in these data? And ultimately, what patterns start to emerge from this existing data?